a mad monk, the Empress's satanic lover, a German spy. But what if I told you all of that is just a smokescreen, a convenient myth that conceals something far more terrifying and far more ingenious? How did a semi-literate Siberian peasant, reeking of sweat and incense, hack his way into the most guarded monarchy on earth? What psychological techniques did he employ to make the Empress hang on his every word and ministers tremble at the mere mention of his name? And the crucial question, what if he wasn't the cause of the empire's illness, but its final, most horrifying symptom? Today, we won't just rehash old gossip. We're going to perform a real autopsy. I'll show you documents from police archives you've never heard of. We'll quantify the true cost of his friendship in concrete figures, in gold, in positions of power, and in hundreds of thousands of human lives. You'll discover who really pulled the strings behind the scenes, transforming his influence into a well-oiled machine of power. This isn't just another biography. This is an anatomy of power. Absolute, irrational, and ruthless power. Watch this video to the very end, and I promise you, you'll grasp Rasputin's ultimate secret. A secret that is more relevant today than ever before. The truth will prove far crazier and more shocking than any myth. Let's dive in. At the very heart of the Russian Empire's agony, at the epicenter of a political maelstrom poised to sweep away a 300-year dynasty, stood a figure holding no official post whatsoever. This man commanded no armies, signed no state decrees, and held not a single position within the autocracy's intricate bureaucratic machinery. His name did not appear on any table of ranks, and from a legal standpoint, his status was simply that of a peasant from Tobolsk governorate. Yet, this very man, Grigory Rasputin, became a dark star, a gravitational center around which the fates of ministers, generals, and the imperial family themselves revolved. This is the central paradox from which our story begins. How could the most influential person in the state essentially be a nobody? This paradox shatters all conventional notions of power. We're accustomed to measuring influence by titles, positions, and wealth. Power, we believe, is about regalia, offices, and decrees. But the phenomenon of Rasputin tells a story of an entirely different kind of power. An irrational, personal, almost alchemical power that proved stronger than all the formal institutions of a vast empire. It seeped through palace walls, ignored hierarchies, and acted directly like a virus, infecting the very command center of the state, the monarch's will. His influence was intangible, yet its consequences were catastrophically real for millions of people. So, let me clarify right away. This won't be just another biography listing scandalous rumors and mystical predictions. Countless such stories have already been told. We're embarking on something different. This will be an intellectual investigation, almost a political thriller, dedicated to the anatomy of informal influence. We'll attempt to understand how this mechanism operates, how one man, possessing no leverage beyond personal charm and the faith of key figures, could effectively become a shadow government, a force to be reckoned with by everyone from the Prime Minister to the ambassadors of great powers. And what truly astounds me here isn't the rumors of his debauchery or supposed miracles. What fascinates me is the sheer mechanics, the political physics of this phenomenon. How did a semi-literate Siberian peasant manage to bypass all barriers, social, cultural, bureaucratic, and establish a direct, unfiltered channel of communication with the heart of an absolute monarchy? How could he speak to the Empress as an equal, advise the autocrat, and strike primal fear and hatred into the hearts of the nation's most powerful aristocrats? This isn't a mystical enigma, but a politological one, and thus all the more intriguing. Indeed, his unseen presence was felt everywhere. It was his name associated with the so-called ministerial merry-go-round, a kaleidoscopic turnover of top officials in the throes of the First World War, which paralyzed the country's governance. His whispers, relayed through the Empress, were believed by many contemporaries to decide the fate of fronts and dictate domestic policy. This was power without accountability, influence without obligation, the most perilous and destructive form of governance imaginable, especially at a time of the greatest national crisis. I invite you to become not just spectators, but active participants in this intellectual investigation. Together, we'll follow the trail of this Siberian elder, not to be shocked or surprised yet again. Our goal is to dissect the Rasputin phenomenon, to separate real influence from the myth created by both his enemies and himself. We'll strive to understand the unique historical, cultural, and psychological environment that made the emergence of such a figure not just possible, but practically inevitable. To see in his story not merely a curiosity, but a mirror reflecting all the mortal ailments of a dying empire. To grasp how the phenomenon of Rasputin even became possible, you need to close your eyes for a moment and try to hear and feel that Russia at a breaking point. Imagine the thick, heavy air of St. Petersburg. This isn't just an urban atmosphere. It's a complex cocktail where the subtle aroma of French perfume, wafting from a passing carriage, instantly mingles with the acrid smell of coal smoke from the industrial outskirts. The air is saturated with a damp, bone-chilling cold emanating from the granite embankments, the scent of wet soldiers' greatcoats, cheap tobacco, and of course the ubiquitous pungent smell of horse manure on the cobblestone streets, the primary transportation fuel of that era. And the sounds. This isn't the monotonous hum of a modern megalopolis. It's a polyphony, the sharp clip-clop of hooves on stone, the creak of unoiled wheels, the drawn-out whistles of steam locomotives from Warsaw Station, the piercing cries of newsboys, and above it all, the distant but constant thrum of factories heralding a new Iron Age. Several key cultural codes were woven into the consciousness of people at that time, without understanding which the Rasputin phenomenon will remain a mystery. The first and foremost code was autocracy. The Tsar in Russia at the turn of the 20th century was not just a monarch, not merely a head of state. He was God's anointed. His power possessed a sacred, almost mystical character. The imperial family was perceived not as a political institution, but as a holy relic, a guarantee of Russia's stability and very existence. And at the heart of this sacred entity lay the sole heir, the ailing boy Alexei. His life wasn't just a child's life, it was the guarantee of the future for the entire vast empire. Any threat to him was perceived as a crack in the very fabric of existence. The second code, closely linked to the first, was the belief in the God-bearing people. Among the elite, weary of Western influences, the myth of the simple Russian peasant, unspoiled by civilization, who held true, deep truth and faith within himself, was incredibly popular. Intellectuals and aristocrats sought this homespun truth, this spiritual authenticity in the common folk. The ideal expression of this popular holiness was the image of the starets, a spiritual mentor, not necessarily a priest, whose wisdom stemmed not from church ranks, but from personal divine enlightenment. This created an enormous public demand for the appearance of precisely such a figure, a simple man of the people who would bring to court not scholarly theological wisdom, but a living, miraculous word. And here the third code comes into play, the crisis of the official church. The Orthodox Church in the empire was a powerful state institution, part of the bureaucratic machine. But for many, and especially for the excitable, deeply mystical Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, this official, formal religiosity offered no answer to her personal pain. She didn't need lavish services and cold sermons. She needed a miracle, right here, right now, a living, tangible intervention of divine power in her son's fate. The official church offered ritual, while Rasputin brought what she so desperately craved, the sensation of a direct, personal dialogue with God, bypassing all intermediaries. These three elements, the sacred figure of the Tsar, the myth of popular holiness, and the spiritual vacuum within high society created ideal conditions, a kind of breeding ground. The system itself generated the demand for Rasputin even before his arrival. The court desperately sought its own popular prophet, a healer who would confirm the divine chosenness of the monarchy and save its future, embodied in the fragile life of the Tsarevich. Rasputin didn't break down the palace doors. He simply happened to be the man for whom those doors had long been wide open. And if we were to find a precise and confident analogy from our modern world, the Rasputin phenomenon could be compared to the appearance of a hacker who discovered a critical vulnerability in the most secure operating system on Earth. The Russian Empire was such a system, with powerful firewalls in the form of court etiquette, bureaucracy, and class barriers. But Rasputin found a backdoor, direct access to the system's core, to the Empress's will, by exploiting her main vulnerability, maternal fear and mystical faith. He didn't hack the system from the outside. He compelled it to grant him administrator rights. The starting point, the catalyst that triggered a chain of irreversible changes and flung open the doors to the palace's inner chambers for Rasputin, wasn't politics, ideology, or court intrigues. It was pure, concentrated pain. The pain of the heir to the throne, Tsarevich Alexei, and the raw, all-consuming fear of his mother, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna. Hemophilia, that royal disease, was more than just a diagnosis. It was a constant, ticking mechanism of destruction embedded in the very heart of the dynasty. Any bruise, any scratch, transformed into a mortal threat, into weeks of agonizing suffering as the empire's finest doctors stood by helplessly, their hands tied in the face of uncontrollable bleeding. And into this atmosphere of absolute hopelessness, where Europe's most powerful family found itself as helpless as the lowliest peasant woman, he entered. Grigory Rasputin. He brought no new medicines or scientific theories. He brought something entirely different, something revolutionary and almost inconceivable for the rational, ordered world of the early 20th century. He brought certainty, not hope, not faith, but rather a primal, almost animal certainty that he could stop the suffering. He didn't speak the language of medicine or theology. He spoke the language of will. His presence, his quiet, hypnotic voice, his piercing gaze, all of it acted as a powerful tranquilizer on the Empress's highly strung nervous system and on the ailing child himself. His great idea was brilliantly simple and utterly unecclesiastical. He offered not ritual, but direct intervention. While priests offered prayers and asked God for help, Rasputin behaved as if he spoke directly with God as an equal and didn't ask, but almost commanded the illness to retreat. His method was a form of radical psychotherapy, blended with folk healing and an unshakable belief in his own chosenness. He didn't cure hemophilia. He alleviated panic. He calmed the mother, and through her, the child calmed. And in a state of calm, vascular spasms lessened, and the bleeding, perhaps, stopped on its own. To science, a coincidence. To Alexandra Feodorovna, a pure, undeniable miracle. The most striking confirmation of this was the famous incident in Spala in the autumn of 1912. The heir was dying. Doctors were already preparing the imperial family for the worst. And then a telegram arrived from far-off Siberia from Rasputin with the words, "The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." This phrase exploded like a bomb in the Empress's mind. It wasn't advice, it was a directive. And it worked. After receiving the telegram, the bleeding stopped and the crisis passed. From that moment on, Rasputin ceased to be merely a man of God for her. He became her personal guardian angel, the sole anchor of salvation in a raging ocean of fear. This episode was the watershed moment. The reaction to this miracle split the Russian ruling class in two. For the tiny group of people inside Alexander Palace, it was final proof of the elder's saintliness. For the rest of the world, the aristocracy, ministers, the general staff, it became proof of something else. The Empress's madness, and the catastrophic, hypnotic influence upon her by a cunning and dangerous charlatan. They watched as the last wall crumbled between a private family tragedy and the governance of a vast country. No one in the Russian establishment expected this. Everyone was accustomed to intrigues, to struggles for influence, to favoritism. But this was something entirely different. They faced not a political opponent who could be removed, bribed, or intimidated. They faced a phenomenon of faith, absolute and irrational. Any attempt to attack Rasputin was now perceived by Alexandra Feodorovna not as a political maneuver, but as sacrilege, an assault on her son's life. This created an impenetrable force field around the elder. And so, Rasputin's emergence as a grey eminence was not the result of a cunning scheme, but rather the consequence of a singular yet incredibly audacious gamble. He staked everything on his ability to control the psychological state of one solitary individual, the Empress. And he won. His audacity wasn't in muscling his way into power, but in convincing those who held power that they simply couldn't survive without him. And in this, he proved terrifyingly persuasive. How exactly did he do it? How did a Siberian peasant, lacking any medical or theological training, repeatedly achieve what the finest medical professors could not? Let's cast aside mysticism and attempt to dissect his method, much like an engineer dismantles an intricate contraption. Because it was indeed a mechanism, but not a mechanical one. Rather, it was psychophysiological. The central metaphor that will help us grasp it all is the principle of acoustic resonance. Rasputin intuitively pinpointed the exact frequency at which the Empress's soul vibrated, the frequency of fear for her son and desperate faith in a miracle. He didn't merely strike this chord, he became its most potent amplifier and retransmitter, drowning out all other signals. Let's peek under the hood of this phenomenon. Rasputin's primary instrument, his emitter, was his renowned eyes. Nearly every memoirist, even his most fervent detractors, noted the hypnotic power of his gaze. This was no mere piercing stare. It was a technique. He didn't just look at a person. He scanned them, fixing his gaze, creating a sensation of complete, undivided attention. This gaze instantly cut through all social barriers, establishing direct, pre-verbal contact. Upon entering the ailing heir's room, his first action was to meet the Empress's eyes. With that single glance, without a word, he conveyed, "I am here. Everything will be all right now. I am in control." This non-verbal signal was the first and most crucial step. It instantly shifted the room's emotional tenor from panic to anticipation. The second element of this mechanism was his speech. He didn't speak the language of the court, nor the language of science. He spoke in parables, in the idiom of the common folk. His speech was slow, deliberate, and rich with imagery from Holy Scripture and peasant life. For the refined court society, accustomed to elegant French turns of phrase and cool politeness, this somewhat coarse yet utterly confident speech resonated like the very voice of the earth itself, as something authentic and immutable. When he declared, "God will help," it wasn't merely a pious wish from a priest. It was a statement of fact from someone who had just spoken with God personally. He created around himself an aura of absolute spiritual authority, where doubt was simply out of place. Now, let's visualize the process itself, breaking it down into distinct steps. Step 1. Diagnosis and panic neutralization. Rasputin enters the room where doctors are bustling around the bedside of the dying Alexei, and nearby, the Empress is in a state of semi-collapse. He doesn't immediately rush to pray. Instead, he assesses the situation. He perceives that the primary adversary at this moment is not hemophilia, but fear. The mother's hysteria transfers to the child, inducing tension, spasms, intensifying the pain, and potentially the bleeding itself. His first task is to break this chain. Authoritatively yet calmly, he dismisses the doctors, requesting them to leave him alone with the family. Step 2. the creation of a therapeutic cocoon. Having eliminated the external irritant of the bustling doctors, he fashions a closed psychological space, himself, the mother, and the child. Within this space, only his rules apply. He approaches the boy, placing his large, heavy peasant hand on his forehead. This simple physical contact holds immense significance. It grounds, soothes, and imparts a sense of protection. He begins to speak, softly, monotonously, almost rhythmically. His voice, his confidence, his physical presence, all of these elements functioned as a potent sedative. Step 3. Inducing a healing state. Rasputin begins to pray. Yet his prayer isn't a recitation of canonical texts. It's more akin to an incantation, an improvisation, a direct dialogue with a higher power. He guides both mother and child into a state bordering on a light trance. In this state of profound psychological calm, genuine physiological changes occur within the body. Adrenaline levels drop, blood pressure falls, and the pulse slows. The body ceases to fight against itself. And in this ensuing stillness, the body's natural defense mechanisms, its blood-clotting system, are given a chance to function. The bleeding ceases. And there it was, the miracle. But in reality, it was an almost surgical process of eradicating panic and cultivating the ideal psychophysiological conditions for the body's self-healing. Rasputin wasn't a wizard. He was a brilliant, intuitive psychotherapist who, without consciously realizing it, employed methods that modern medicine would call neuro-linguistic programming and hypnotherapy. He didn't heal the blood, he healed the fear. Yet, in the case of hemophilia, it turned out to be one and the same. To truly grasp the scope of the Rasputin phenomenon, we need to shift our focus from the imperial chambers to the cold, wind-swept streets of St. Petersburg. Let's view history through the eyes of an ordinary person whose life was inextricably linked with his. But not a petitioner, rather a secret police agent. Let's immediately establish a fact. From a certain point onward, Rasputin was subjected to round-the-clock, total surveillance. This meant that several shifts of secret agents, relieving one another, spent their lives lurking in alleyways, freezing in horse-drawn carriages, and pretending to read newspapers in taverns across the street. During this surveillance, one such agent would spend thousands of hours awaiting and observing Rasputin, a time comparable to several years of continuous, monotonous, and grueling work. And all of this was for the sake of documenting every single step taken by one Siberian peasant. These nameless men, in their bowler hats and nondescript overcoats, were the true chroniclers of his daily life. Their dry, bureaucratic reports, preserved in archives, constitute the most reliable source of information, devoid of mysticism and speculation. They meticulously recorded: subject left the house at 11:05 a.m., boarded cab number 347, drove along Gorokhovaya Street. A veiled lady arrived to meet the subject, stayed 42 minutes. Beneath these lines lies more than just police routine. They contain documentary evidence that the state perceived Rasputin as a threat, or at the very least, as a vital strategic asset requiring colossal resources for control. His influence was measured not only by rumor, but also by the very tangible budget allocated to the police department for his protection and surveillance. However, Rasputin's genius could not have fully materialized without one unobvious but absolutely pivotal figure standing behind him. This person was Aaron Simonovich, the elder's personal secretary, financier, and manager. If Rasputin was the source of spiritual capital, then Simonovich was the one who converted this capital into very real money, positions, and services. A jeweler by profession and an adventurer by nature, he possessed an incredible knack for people and connections in all spheres, from banking circles to the criminal underworld. He was the ideal chief operating officer for the spontaneous and chaotic enterprise known as Grigory Rasputin. It was Simonovich who built the system. He organized the reception of petitioners, screened out unpromising ones, and maintained the unofficial accounting of donations. When an industrialist approached Rasputin seeking assistance in securing a military contract, it was Simonovich who subsequently conducted negotiations with the necessary officials. When a disgraced general wished to return to service, Simonovich found channels through which the request could be passed upstairs, after the elder had already put in a good word. Without this pragmatic and cynical organizer, Rasputin's influence might have remained confined to spiritual conversations and healings. Simonovich transformed him into a functioning institution, a shadow ministry capable of solving concrete earthly problems and naturally deriving considerable profit from it. Now, let's step into Rasputin's apartment on Gorokhovaya Street to observe one striking everyday detail that best illustrates his place within this system. Imagine a cramped, perpetually smoke-filled reception room, where the thick air is permeated by a blend of frankincense, sour cabbage, cheap perfume, and the sweat of dozens of people. And in this room, shoulder to shoulder, sat utterly disparate characters waiting for their turn. Here, a guards colonel's wife, come to plead for her husband, might sit beside a peasant woman from outside Ryazan, carrying her last ruble in a small cloth bundle, hoping the elder would pray for her sick cow. Right there, too, a distinguished banker with a briefcase, hoping for patronage, and some truth-seeking sectarian arrived for spiritual guidance. This apartment was a unique place in the entire Russian Empire. It was a nexus where the social hierarchy, the very backbone of autocracy, simply ceased to exist. Here, there were no ranks, no titles, and no distinctions. Everyone was equal in their need and in their belief that this strange peasant with the piercing eyes was their last hope. People came to him because the official state machinery was too cumbersome, too slow, too corrupt, and indifferent to their plights. Rasputin's apartment became an alternative center of power, an unofficial one-stop shop for resolving any issue, operating faster and, as many perceived, more efficiently than the entire imperial bureaucracy. It was this human element, these surveillance agents, this shrewd secretary, these throngs of desperate petitioners, that forged the real fabric of Rasputin's influence. His power wasn't solely in his personal charisma. It lay in the weakness and paralysis of state institutions, which he didn't demolish, but simply circumvented. He wasn't the cause of the illness, but its most striking and grotesque symptom. The people behind the scenes of his story, each in their own way, unwittingly helped him construct his shadow empire, which grew like a tumor in the very heart of Russia. For a long time, the system built around Rasputin operated within its own self-contained, almost hermetic world. He offered solace, gave advice, received petitioners, all of it part of court life, scandalous yet internal. But in August of 1914, a shot rang out in Sarajevo, and the world collapsed. The First World War began. This global cataclysm became the perfect storm that battered the fragile structure of Russian autocracy and propelled the Rasputin phenomenon from palace backrooms onto the stage of world history. Initially, it seemed that the war would unite the nation, but it also became a merciless X-ray, highlighting all the fatal fissures within the state organism. Rasputin's plan, if he even had one, was to preserve his unique status as the guardian of the imperial family. But the war changed everything. It demanded maximum efficiency, competence, and coordination from the state machinery. And precisely these qualities were absent from a system afflicted by informal influence. The turning point, after which everything went awry, was Nicholas II's fatal decision in August of 1915. Against the advice of all his ministers, he left the capital for the military headquarters and assumed the title of Supreme Commander-in-Chief. From the Emperor's perspective, this was a patriotic duty. From the standpoint of state governance, it was a disaster. The Tsar's departure for the front created an enormous power vacuum in Petrograd, And into this vacuum immediately stepped Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, who became the de facto regent. And behind her, no longer concealed, stood Grigory Rasputin. His influence, previously confined primarily to family and personnel matters, now, like a surging river, flooded into the realms of high politics, economics, and military administration. The Empress, under constant stress and receiving letters from her husband pleading for help with matters on the home front, made the elder her primary and sole advisor on all issues. His word became decisive, and here the ruthless dialectic of strength and weakness came into play. That very absolute faith the Empress had in Rasputin, which was his greatest strength and his impenetrable shield, transformed into the chief vulnerability for the entire state system. His intuitive, divinely inspired advice, which perhaps worked as psychotherapy on the scale of one family, proved utterly ruinous on the scale of a vast, warring nation. The scalpel with which he delicately operated on one person's nerves became a sledgehammer, smashing the complex machinery of imperial governance. The infamous ministerial merry-go-round began. In a year and a half, Russia saw 4 chairmen of the Council of Ministers, 6 ministers of internal affairs, and 3 war ministers. Competence, experience, and professionalism ceased to matter. The sole criterion for appointment to the highest state post became loyalty or, conversely, disloyalty to our friend, as the Empress called Rasputin. Honest and professional ministers who tried to object or point out the detrimental nature of this influence were dismissed from their posts. Their places were filled either by blatant careerists, eager to kiss the elder's hand, or simply by nobodies, convenient in their subservience. This sent shockwaves and horror through the ranks of the Russian elite. Grand dukes, aristocrats, State Duma deputies, generals, they all watched as the country hurtled towards the abyss. They wrote letters to the Tsar, tried to reach him, to warn him of the danger. But all their efforts crashed against a brick wall. Nicholas at the front was isolated, and Alexandra Feodorovna in Tsarskoye Selo perceived any criticism of Rasputin as betrayal and a personal affront. The system had lost its feedback loop. It ceased to respond to danger signals, transforming into a self-destructing machine. It was at this moment that a final breaking point occurred in the minds of many members of the ruling class. They realized that this problem could no longer be solved through legal or political means. The Tsar wasn't listening. The Tsarina was obsessed. Rasputin, sensing his complete impunity, grew increasingly brazen and influential. The state was paralyzed in the midst of the most terrifying war in history. And then, in the elite drawing rooms and guards' barracks, a terrifying, unspoken, yet utterly logical question began to hang in the air. If the pawn controlling the queen cannot be removed, what then remains to be done with the pawn itself? When we gaze upon the figure of Rasputin, it's incredibly tempting to fall into one of 2 extremes, either seeing him as a demonic puppet master who single-handedly brought down an empire, or dismissing him as an innocent victim of slander. But intellectual honesty demands we acknowledge other, far more nuanced interpretations. One of the most pervasive alternative theories, especially during the war years, painted Rasputin as a German spy. The logic was chillingly simple. The elder consistently opposed war with Germany and advocated for a separate peace. Who stood to gain? Berlin, naturally. This narrative, bolstered by Empress Alexandra Feodorovna's German heritage, transformed into a potent propaganda weapon. It perfectly accounted for every battlefield failure and the paralysis of power on the home front. Even though not a single piece of concrete evidence was ever found linking him to German intelligence, this myth proved incredibly resilient, offering a straightforward and digestible explanation for the unfolding catastrophe. Another theory, more contemporary and nuanced, views Rasputin not as a cause, but as a symptom, and more profoundly, as a universal scapegoat. According to this interpretation, by 1916, the Russian monarchy was already critically ill. It was not the machinations of a single elder that were destroying it. but a deep-seated systemic crisis, an archaic political system, the unresolved peasant question, pervasive social tension, and finally, the crushing burden of a world war. In this climate, the elite, both liberal and conservative, desperately needed an enemy. Yet, directly criticizing the anointed of God, the emperor himself, was still unthinkable. It would have meant tearing down the entire edifice. So, all the hatred, all the disappointment, all the frustration was redirected towards a convenient and easily digestible target: the dark, depraved peasant who had supposedly bewitched the Empress. Rasputin became a lightning rod, allowing the elites to despise the government while formally maintaining loyalty to the monarch. He was not the cancerous tumor itself, but its most grotesque and visible metastasis. But beneath all these theories lay a very tangible economy. Rasputin's influence wasn't merely an abstract force, it was a commodity, the most expensive and scarce currency in Petrograd. And this currency had its own central bank and its own finance minister in his secretary, Aaron Simonovich. Around the elder, an entire shadow economy of services flourished. A petition passed through him fetched exorbitant sums. A note from him, with just a couple of words, could decide a multi-million ruble military contract or rescue an entire bank from ruin. From money, jewels, favors, all of it flowed in an uninterrupted stream into his apartment on Gorokovaya Street. Rasputin himself, it seems, was rather indifferent to personal wealth and readily distributed the money he received, yet the system he spawned operated like a finely tuned commercial engine. Let's try to grasp the sheer scale of this economy through a concrete example. One of Rasputin's most scandalous protégés was the banker Dmitry Rubinstein, a shadowy operator and financial swindler. When he was arrested for illicit dealings and collaboration with the Germans, Rasputin's intervention, channeled through the Empress, led to his release. Once free, Rubinstein resumed his operations. Consider this: the financial damage inflicted upon the state by just one of his schemes, a stock manipulation involving Russian banks conducted under the elder's tacit patronage, was comparable to the cost of constructing a new destroyer, a vessel the Navy desperately needed. This wasn't merely a matter of bribes. This was influence capable of inflicting direct and measurable economic damage on a warring nation, on the scale of entire industries. And of course, all his actions were imbued with hidden meanings. His deliberate simplicity, his addressing the Emperor and Empress as Papa and Mama, this was far more than a sign of rustic informality. It was a deeply symbolic act, a political manifesto. By addressing them this way, he ostentatiously positioned himself outside the entire state hierarchy. He was not their subject. He became a member of their family, their spiritual father, someone who stood not beneath them, but rather beside them, on an entirely different plane. Through this, he signaled to the entire court, to all the ministers and generals, "You are all servants, officials, but I am the friend. Your power is founded on law and the table of ranks. Mine is rooted in divine providence and personal connection." Thus, the true nature of the Rasputin phenomenon encompasses not only behind-the-scenes machinations, but also a powerful shadow economy and an intricate dance of symbols. He didn't just offer advice, he peddled access to the inner sanctum of power, and every one of his gestures was aimed at undermining and delegitimizing the empire's official institutions. He intuitively grasped that in a crumbling state, real power wasn't about a title, but about proximity to the ultimate decision-makers. And he cornered the market on that proximity, transforming it into the most profitable and destructive asset of his era. And now, having dissected this incredibly complex mechanism, having seen the hypnotic sway of his personality, the political vacuum created by the war and the Tsar's departure, the cynical commercial engine of his secretary, and the profound cultural yearning for a people's saint, the picture begins to snap into terrifying focus. All these disparate threads, psychology, politics, economics, and mysticism, weave together into a single, taught not. We have gathered all the evidence, interviewed every witness, and are now ready to approach the main question. What then is the ultimate riddle of Grigory Rasputin's phenomenon? The answer, it seems to me, is simultaneously simpler and more chilling than any conspiracy theory. The key to the Rasputin phenomenon is that he was neither a destroyer of the system nor its secret ruler. His true historical function lay elsewhere. He was the great substitute. He became a living, breathing human surrogate for all the governmental and public institutions that by that point in Russia had either died or were in a state of paralysis. He didn't break the system. He simply stepped in and occupied the void it had left behind. Let's examine this more closely. The official church, which had devolved into a mere department of religious affairs, offered the Empress cold ritual and formal solace. It could not give her what she desperately craved, a living, tangible miracle and personal hope. And Rasputin arrived, effectively substituting for the church. He became for Alexandra Feodorovna her personal patriarch, her private prophet, her direct conduit to God, one that worked flawlessly and on demand. The imperial bureaucracy, cumbersome, corrupt and soulless, could not solve the problems of millions of ordinary people. It was blind and deaf to their pleas. And then Rasputin's apartment on Gorokovaya Street substituted for this entire machine. It became an alternative government, an unofficial ministry of emergency relief, where anyone, from a banker to a peasant woman, could come and get their issue resolved. Yes, through a bribe, through humiliation, but they got results they could not achieve through official channels. When the emperor left for the front, he left a gaping hole in the capital where supreme political will once stood. Ministers floundered, the government lost its bearings, and Rasputin, through the Empress, substituted for the Prime Minister and Chief Advisor. He didn't seize power, he simply picked it up where its legitimate holder had dropped it. His advice was ruinous, his appointments catastrophic, but he provided what no one else could, the sense that someone, anyone, was still at the helm, that decisions, however insane, were still being made. This was his unintended genius. He intuitively pinpointed every point of failure, every dead zone of the immense state organism, and offered himself as a universal prosthesis. He became the living embodiment of informal power at a moment when formal authority had lost all substance and meaning. He was not the cause of the empire's illness. He was its last, most desperate, and most grotesque attempt at self-medication. And the tragedy lay in the fact that this prosthesis prevented the system from regenerating. On the contrary, it only accelerated its atrophy. By substituting for once functioning institutions, he rendered them utterly superfluous. By providing the monarchy with a personal psychological crutch, he weaned it off walking independently, allowing it to ignore, until the very end, the fact that its legs had long since atrophied. He was the painkiller that allowed the empire to die without agony, in a strange, mystical twilight sleep. And when we grasp this, the magnitude of Rasputin's figure appears in an entirely different light. This is no longer simply a story about a cunning peasant and a weak empress. This is a design of titanic, almost divine scale, but the author of this design was history itself. It presented in one man the perfect mirror in which a dying civilization saw its own reflection. Instead of faith, superstition. Instead of law, arbitrary rule. Instead of the state, an individual. Rasputin was not a man, he was a verdict. The long echo of Rasputin's life, or more accurately, his death, began to reverberate immediately. The conspirators in killing him believed they were performing a surgical operation to save the monarchy. They thought that by removing the tumor, they would restore the body's health. But they misdiagnosed. Rasputin was not a tumor, but the last crutch on which the paralyzed regime leaned. By kicking away that crutch, they did not make it walk. They only hastened its fall. The domino effect, set in motion by the gunshots in the Yusupov Palace, proved swift and devastating. The elder's murder did not rally the elite around the throne. On the contrary, it demonstrated to everyone, the people, the army, and the revolutionaries, that power was utterly paralyzed. If members of the imperial family and monarchist deputies could assassinate the Tsar's personal friend with impunity, then the sacred aura of the throne had completely dissipated. Anything was possible. This very signal became the trigger. Just 2 months after Rasputin's murder, the February Revolution erupted in Petrograd. Soldiers sent to suppress it defected to the rebels. Generals who had sworn loyalty just yesterday advised the emperor to abdicate. The entire structure collapsed almost instantly, like a house of cards. And while Rasputin was not the direct cause of the revolution, his figure, and more importantly, the myth created around him, became the catalyst that transformed simmering discontent into open rebellion. The myth of Rasputin became the most effective weapon of anti-monarchist propaganda. It allowed the complex crisis of the empire to be reduced to a simple, easily digestible formula. A weak Tsar, a German Tsarina, and a cunning, depraved peasant are leading Russia to ruin. This formula proved stronger than all armies and police departments. It destroyed faith, the primary resource of autocracy. But what's most astonishing is how his legacy lives on in our culture today, often in the most unexpected forms. Every time you hear the famous Boney M song, Rasputin, you are, without realizing it, touching upon this legacy. This upbeat disco track is a perfect example of how a complex historical tragedy transforms into a simple, easily digestible pop culture myth. In a 4-minute track, all the drama is distilled into a catchy image. Ra Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen. He appears as a mystical lover and political schemer, Russia's greatest love machine. This image, infinitely far from reality, has proved incredibly resilient, replacing actual history for millions of people worldwide. Or take cinema. Grigory Rasputin, in essence, became the prototype for one of the most potent and enduring archetypes in global culture. The archetype of the evil advisor, or mad monk. A dark, charismatic figure with a hypnotic gaze who infiltrates a ruler's trust and secretly begins to control the state, pushing it towards ruin. Think of Wormtongue from The Lord of the Rings, whispering in King Theoden's ear, or Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars. Every time such a character appears on screen, we see Rasputin's shadow. He created such a powerful and recognizable image that it detached itself from its original bearer and took on a life of its own, becoming a universal symbol of shadowy, destructive power. And therein lies the central paradox of his legacy. The myth of Rasputin, as we know it, was not created by revolutionaries or Bolsheviks. Its principal authors were staunch monarchists, aristocrats, people who genuinely wished to save Russia and the throne. Prince Yusupov, Deputy Purishkevich, and the other conspirators deliberately demonized the elder's image to justify his assassination in the eyes of society and history. They spoke of his unheard-of debauchery, of German espionage, of a devilish power, so that their act would appear not as a vile murder, but as a heroic deed for the sake of the fatherland. But in unleashing this genie from the bottle, they overlooked one crucial detail. The monstrous image they created ricocheted, striking not so much the deceased elder as the monarchy itself. By demonizing Rasputin, they inadvertently proved the incompetence and weakness of an emperor who allowed such a monster into the very heart of power. Their propaganda, aimed at saving the system, functioned as the most potent battering ram for its destruction. In the end, the Grand Dukes and patriotic monarchists proved to be the most effective gravediggers of autocracy, doing more to discredit it than all the underground revolutionary parties combined. Such is history's irony. The weapon forged for defense delivered a fatal blow to its own master. What could seem more remote, more distant from us, than this century-old tale of a bearded peasant, tsars, and palace intrigues? But listen closely, just for a moment, and you'll hear the resounding echo of those events astonishingly reverberate with the clamor of our 21st century. We live in an era when trust in traditional institutions, governments, science, the press, is at an all-time low. We see society polarizing, fracturing into warring information bubbles, where each side clings to its own truth, impervious to others. And we observe how, on this fertile ground of widespread distrust and exhaustion from complexity, charismatic figures sprout like mushrooms after a rain, offering simple, intuitive answers to the most convoluted questions. The bridge to the present day forms naturally here. The Petrograd salons, where aristocrats whispered the wildest rumors about Rasputin to one another, aren't they the very precursor to our social media, where conspiracy theories spread at the speed of light? The desperation of the Empress, willing to believe anyone just to save her child. Doesn't it echo the desperation of people today who, disillusioned with official medicine, turn to a world of alternative healers and anti-science cults? The phenomenon of Rasputin isn't a story about the past. It's an eternal narrative about what happens when a vacuum of trust forms within society. And here we can crystallize the main, non-trivial lesson of this entire story. The lesson isn't that we shouldn't let charlatans into power. That's far too obvious. The lesson runs far deeper. It lies in the fact that the greatest threat to a complex system isn't an external enemy, but an internal vacuum of meaning and trust. Rasputin wasn't a powerful demon who arrived and destroyed a flourishing empire. He was merely an opportunistic infection that could only proliferate to deadly proportions because the state's immune system was already defunct. He didn't create chaos. He simply arrived and filled the void left behind by bankrupt institutions. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does politics. When the official church fails to offer solace, people will find comfort with a sectarian. When official medicine proves powerless, they'll turn to a quack. When the official government fails to solve their problems, they'll pledge their faith and loyalty to anyone who even pretends to hear them. Rasputin wasn't the cause of the illness, but its symptom. He was living proof that the system had stopped working, that its official channels had become clogged, and its language dead and incomprehensible to the very people it was meant to govern. He was a potent placebo for a dying monarchy. He didn't heal, but he alleviated the pain of fear and indecision, creating an illusion of control and divine patronage. And under the influence of this narcotic, the country continued to decay, ignoring the true causes of its sickness. And herein lies his most terrifying lesson for us. There is always the temptation to believe in a simple magical solution that will spare us the need to undertake the complex and arduous work of repairing our own imperfect, fraying institutions. And as we conclude this preliminary summary, I want to leave you with one thought. The Rasputins of the 21st century don't wear peasant shirts or speak of God. They might wear expensive suits, deliver TED Talks, or manage popular blogs. But their function remains the same: to fill the vacuum, offering simple recipes for happiness and order in a complex and frightening world. And the story of the Siberian elder is an eternal reminder that when the official map of reality ceases to correspond with the territory of people's lives, they inevitably begin to draw their own maps. And on these new maps, monsters and prophets aren't just possible, they are necessary. To grasp the full depth of the tragedy, we must make an intellectual effort and view the events through the eyes of those commonly considered Rasputin's enemies. And here, it's crucial to immediately discard the caricatured image of envious, hidebound aristocrats. These weren't merely operetta villains, these were individuals who represented a complex civilization built over centuries, the civilization of the Russian Empire. They were both products and custodians of a world founded on order, hierarchy, service, and honor, as they understood it. Their truth held no less weight than the Empress's faith. Their truth was Russia as a great power. For someone like Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna, or General Alexei Brusilov, The world was logically and clearly structured. There was the table of ranks. There was court etiquette. There was the Holy Synod, regulating spiritual life. There was military subordination. The state was a complex but predictable mechanism where every cog knew its place. And they, the elite, were the chief engineers and mechanics of this mechanism. Their task was to ensure its smooth operation, especially amidst the looming war and revolution. Their goal was the preservation and strengthening of the empire, not personal gain. And into this ordered, rational, hierarchical world, Rasputin bursts forth. Let's try to see him through their eyes. To them, he was not just a peasant. He was an absolute, inconceivable anomaly, a system glitch. He was the embodiment of primeval, irrational chaos that had invaded the very center of power, the Holy of Holies. He obeyed none of the laws they knew, neither divine nor human. He ignored etiquette, addressed the autocrats as Papa and Mama, and might appear at the palace in muddy boots. He didn't fit into any existing category. He was neither a priest, nor an official, nor a courtier. He was a nobody. And it was this nobody who suddenly proved more powerful than all of them. The cultural shock was colossal. Imagine the board of directors of a massive corporation where all decisions are suddenly being made by the janitor who claims the spirit of the company founder speaks to him at night. For the elite, Rasputin was not just a political problem. He was an aesthetic insult, a slap in the face to their entire world, their upbringing, their education, their conception of the dignity of power. His crude speech, his murky prophecies, his scandalous behavior in restaurants, all of this was for them not merely personal flaws, but symptoms of a terrible disease that had afflicted the apex of power. They watched as the sacred image of the monarchy, which they were obligated to protect, transformed before their very eyes into a sideshow, a bad joke. And here we approach the tragedy of their predictability. Why couldn't they, so powerful, intelligent and influential, do anything about him for so long? Precisely because their strengths, their belief in order, in law, in hierarchy, became their greatest weakness. They tried to fight chaos with systematic methods. They initiated official investigations by the Synod. They submitted memoranda to the Emperor. They tried to act through ministers. They were playing chess, while their opponent had overturned the board and was beating them over the head with the pieces. All their weapons proved useless because Rasputin was outside the system. Any official complaint against him, lodged according to all the rules, shattered against the Empress's irrational faith. Any attempt to prove his harmfulness was perceived by her as an intrigue against her personally and against her son's life. The elite found themselves trapped. Their own loyalty to the monarchy prevented them from acting against the monarch's will. They couldn't stage a palace coup. They couldn't publicly declare the Empress insane. They were bound hand and foot by the very rules that Rasputin so easily ignored. Thus, for Rasputin's enemies, this was not merely a struggle for power. It was the battle of order against chaos, civilization against barbarism, which had invaded its very heart. And their tragedy lay in the fact that, having exhausted all civilized methods, they were ultimately forced themselves to resort to a method of pure chaos, to a secret, treacherous assassination. To save order, they had to commit the most disorderly and lawless act, ultimately becoming just like the one they fought. Power is the most potent poison, and Rasputin's genius lay not only in touching it, but in making others drink it with him. But this genius came at an exorbitant price, and it was paid not only by Russia, but by himself. Behind the facade of an omnipotent elder lay the profound personal drama of a man who, having soared too high, found himself in absolute icy solitude, where every moral compromise was a step towards self-destruction. His dark side isn't just about rumors of drunkenness and debauchery. It's the story of how a soul, perhaps once searching for God, was entirely devoured by the demon of power. The story of Minister of War, Vladimir Sukhomlinov, serves as the most striking example of such a moral compromise. By 1915, there was arguably no more hated figure in Russia. He was blamed for the army's catastrophic unpreparedness for war, for the horrific shell famine that left soldiers on the front lines repelling German attacks with just 3 rounds per rifle. The entire Duma, the whole general staff, indeed all of society, demanded his resignation and trial. This was a rare instance when both the monarchy's enemies and allies were united, and it would have been logical and right for the country. But Sukhomlinov's wife was one of Rasputin's most loyal and influential devotees, and so the elder faced a choice. On one side of the scale lay the army's well-being, the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and potentially the outcome of the war. On the other, loyalty to his loyalist, the retention of a key figure in his inner circle who ensured his access and influence in military circles. And Rasputin made his choice. He threw his full weight behind defending Sukhomlinov. In his conversations with the Empress, he called him an honest man, slandered by enemies, and convinced her that the minister's resignation was an intrigue against the throne. He did not choose Russia. He chose his personal network of influence. This act was no longer about healing or spiritual seeking. It was a cynical political game where human lives were the stakes. The holy elder shielded egregious incompetence, and the price of that was measured in blood on the fields of Galicia. These choices, and others like them, inevitably changed him. The Grigori who once walked barefoot on Siberian roads in search of truth died. In his place emerged a different man, a man who began to believe in his own infallibility and chosenness. The constant adoration, flattery, and sense of power over the destinies of the empire's most powerful people, all of it corrupted him to his very core. The burden of responsibility he shouldered was inhuman. He was the Empress's sole advisor, the final arbiter. This role demanded divine wisdom, and he was merely a man. And this tension broke him. He found himself at the pinnacle, utterly alone. He had no friends, only petitioners and followers. He had no advisors. He was the chief advisor himself. This isolation transformed him from a cunning manipulator into a paranoid pragmatist. He saw intrigues and conspiracies everywhere, and the only way to protect himself was to place his people, even if foolish and incompetent, in all positions. His notorious binges, drunkenness, and orgies, these were not merely manifestations of debauchery. They were a psychological breakdown, an attempt to escape the unbearable burden of power and loneliness, to unleash the monstrous tension that burned him from within. The idealist, if he ever truly was one, finally yielded to the tyrant of his small world. And on the altar of this success, he unhesitatingly sacrificed even those who had once been close to him. The most telling example was the story of hero monk Iliador. At the beginning of their journey, they were almost brothers, comrades in arms in the struggle for popular faith against the state church. Iliador, a fervent and charismatic preacher, was one of those who paved Rasputin's way into high society. But Iliador was too ambitious, too uncontrollable. He himself wanted to be a spiritual leader. And when he saw that Rasputin had bypassed him and taken the place near the throne that he himself had coveted, he turned into his fiercest enemy. Rasputin would not tolerate a rival. He, the ally of yesterday, used all his influence on the imperial family to destroy Iliador. He portrayed him as an intriguer, a madman, an enemy of the monarchy. As a result, the synod, under court pressure, stripped Iliador of his monastic rank and exiled him to a monastic prison. The former comrade who helped him ascend was ruthlessly crushed and cast out of the game. This story best shows what Rasputin had become. To remain the sole and indispensable figure, he was ready to devour anyone, both enemy and friend. The price of his genius proved to be a complete loss of humanity, a scorched desert around the throne, in the center of which he stood, omnipotent, lonely, and doomed. When Rasputin entered the world of the St. Petersburg aristocracy, it was more than just an introduction. It was the collision of two tectonic plates, two distinct, mutually exclusive civilizations. On one side stood cold, rational, European St. Petersburg, with its flawlessly polished parquet floors, French spoken in hushed tones, strict etiquette, and a reverence for order. On the other, Rasputin himself, a living relic of archaic, primal, mystical Rus, with its belief in the evil eye and curses, in holy fools and prophets, with its scent of earth, sweat and incense. And the epicenter of this clash was his apartment on Gorokovaya Street. It was more than just a dwelling. It was an anomalous zone, a portal where two worlds did not merge in harmony, but instead plunged into a brutal, irreconcilable conflict. Primarily, this conflict unfolded on a religious plane. The empire's state orthodoxy was a well-oiled machine, an integral part of the bureaucratic apparatus. Priests were government employees, prayers were protocol, and faith was a mere ritual. Rasputin, however, brought with him a completely different kind of faith, wild, ecstatic, and deeply personal. He didn't just ask God for mercy, he conversed with him. He didn't follow canons, he forged them on the fly. To the court clergy, he was a dangerous heretic, almost a cult leader, shattering centuries-old foundations. To him, they were cold, bookish Pharisees who had lost their living connection to God. This conflict was irreconcilable because it wasn't a battle of dogmas, but of temperaments, a struggle of organized institutional faith against spontaneous, revelatory belief. And at the crossroads of these worlds, the most astonishing and bizarre cultural hybrids began to emerge. Imagine a high society lady, a courtier with impeccable French pronunciation, who had spent her entire life surrounded by imperial guardsmen and diplomats. Now, after a few conversations with Rasputin, she begins speaking of divine love, falling into prophetic trances, scornfully dismissing the superficial world and seeking homespun truth in the words of a Siberian peasant. This was a genuine spiritual mutation. These aristocrats, draped in silks and pearls, attempting to mimic Rasputin's peasant simplicity and mysticism, appeared as exotic, non-viable hybrids. They were the most striking product of this cultural schism, people who had lost their own civilization but never truly managed to assimilate into another's. Another hybrid was political life itself. A monstrous fusion occurred, blending Byzantine court intrigue with rustic superstition. A minister seeking an appointment now not only had to prepare memoranda and secure support within the state council. He had to go pay homage to Rasputin, sit humbly in his waiting room, listen to his cryptic admonitions, and receive a blessing. And then this mystical blessing was used as a very real political argument in the struggle for a ministerial portfolio. The pragmatic cynicism of the St. Petersburg bureaucracy entered an unnatural alliance with an irrational belief in the power of the starets, giving birth to a political monster that obeyed neither logic nor law. So how did this transform the daily life of someone caught at this intersection of civilizations, say, an average courtier or official? Their world was turned upside down. Old habits, based on career advancement, seniority, and professionalism, simply ceased to function. They crumbled into dust. A new, primary habit emerged, an essential condition for survival, constantly asking oneself, how will Grigory Yefimovich react to this? One had to learn to speak a new language, understand veiled hints, and know which of the elders' entourage to approach to convey a petition. The entire life of high society devolved into a schizophrenic game. At official receptions, they had to observe etiquette and pretend everything was as it always had been, while secretly traveling to Gorokovaya Street at night, or sending their wives there to resolve real problems. This cultural cauldron did not produce a new, healthy synthesis. It did not meld the best of two worlds. Instead, it forged a toxic, viscous environment where all concepts became muddled and values were turned completely upside down. The aristocracy, in its attempt to imitate the common people, appeared pathetic. The common people, embodied by Rasputin, upon grasping power, lost the last vestiges of their supposed sanctity. This melting pot did not forge a new nation. It brought the old one to a boiling point and ultimate dissolution, leaving behind only a scorched earth upon which entirely different, bloody seeds would soon sprout. The phenomenon of Rasputin unfolded not only in palaces and on battlefields, but also on an invisible front, what we would today call the field of information warfare. And on this field, he was not merely an object, but an active player. Rasputin, perhaps intuitively but brilliantly, grasped the fundamental law of public relations. Either you create your own image, or your enemies will create it for you. And he purposefully constructed his myth using the most effective tools of the time: rumors, performance, and personal charisma. His public persona as a simple peasant and a man of God was a meticulously crafted role. He deliberately wore peasant shirts and boots in high society, spoke with a deliberate Siberian accent, and refused any official posts. This was his uniform, his brand, screaming, "I am not like you, I am authentic." The primary disseminators of his myth were not newspapers, but his enthusiastic female followers from high society and, of course, the Empress herself. They were his evangelists. Every successful prediction, every instance of healing was immediately spread through elite salons, growing into incredible elaborations. Tales circulated of how he located a stolen necklace through the power of prayer, how he foretold a drought, how he calmed a rabid dog with a single glance. Rasputin himself expertly fueled these rumors, uttering vague, ambiguous prophecies that could be interpreted however one wished. He created an aura of the supernatural around himself, transforming his life into a living hagiography written in real time. His deification was not merely flattery, it was a political tool that made his figure untouchable. Naturally, for every assertion by his supporters, his enemies responded with a devastating antithesis. The counter-propaganda against Rasputin was no less powerful and sophisticated. If he cultivated the image of a saint, his opponents molded him into the image of the Antichrist. For this, the entire arsenal of black propaganda was deployed. Rumors circulated about his supposed affiliation with the Klisti sect, about monstrous orgies he allegedly orchestrated under the guise of prayer meetings. Caricatures were published depicting him as a giant spider entangling Russia in his web. The most potent blow, however, was the myth of his working for German intelligence. This rumor, actively spread in both the Duma and the press, was a brilliant move. It transformed Rasputin from a court favorite into an enemy of the nation, a traitor working for the Kaiser in the midst of war. It was these myths, created by his enemies, that proved to be the most resilient. Why? Because they were simpler, more vivid, and provided an exhaustive answer to the core question: who is to blame? The image of a depraved, drunken, corrupt spy controlling a spineless Tsar through a hysterical German Empress proved incredibly popular. It has survived to this day and is firmly entrenched in mass culture, from Hollywood films to the Boney M song. The demonic image of Rasputin won the information war because it suited absolutely everyone. Monarchists justifying his murder, liberals discrediting the autocracy, and Bolsheviks proving the rottenness of the old regime. And here we arrive at the cardinal principle. History is written by the victors. Let's look at how this works, using one event as an example. Take the murder of Rasputin itself. The official version, presented to the world by the victor, Prince Felix Yusupov, in his memoirs, is a true mystical thriller. In this version, Rasputin appears as an almost immortal demon. He consumes cakes and drinks wine laced with a lethal dose of potassium cyanide, and it has no effect on him. He survives a gunshot to the heart, revives, attempts to strangle his killer, and tries to escape. It takes several more shots to stop him. This version transformed a banal murder into an epic battle of good versus evil, and the conspirators into heroic champions. Now, let's look at the archaeological data, at the autopsy report compiled by Professor Kosorotov. No traces of poison were found in Rasputin's stomach. Death resulted from gunshot wounds, with the final bullet to the forehead fired at virtually point-blank range. There was no rising from the dead. So what happened? Most likely, Yusupov and his accomplices either, in a panic, failed to properly poison their victim, or more probably, the entire story about the poison was fabricated from beginning to end. Why? To create a myth, to justify a brutal and essentially cowardly execution of an unarmed man. Yusupov's version was not historical testimony, but a public relations stunt. A brilliantly executed information operation that allowed him and his accomplices to enter history not as despicable murderers, but as saviors of the fatherland from an evil force. And this version, created by the victor for many years, overshadowed the dull and unappealing truth. If the first turning point was the miracle in Spala, the second, definitive point of no return was crossed in August of 1915. This wasn't a sudden decision, but rather a chain of events. Yet the catalyst was Nicholas II's departure to the general headquarters. It was at this moment that the original intention, however dubious it might have been, became irreversibly distorted. Initially, Rasputin was a cure for one family, albeit the ruling one. His function was therapeutic, to soothe, to heal, to be a spiritual crutch. But when the Tsar left, leaving behind a vacuum of supreme power, Rasputin, through the Empress, transformed from a remedy into a political instrument. The end ceased to justify the means. The means, that is, his boundless influence over the Empress, became an end in themselves. Now, it was no longer about saving the heir, but about governing an empire. And in this new role, he proved catastrophically destructive. This fatal decision led to a profound internal schism, not just within the elite, but within the imperial family itself. And this schism was most vividly manifested in the tragic conflict between two sisters, two former like-minded individuals, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna and Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna. Elizabeth, the Empress's biological sister, was a figure utterly opposite to Rasputin. After her husband's murder, she withdrew from the world, founded the Marfo-Mariinsky convent, and dedicated herself to serving the poor. She was the embodiment of aristocratic, ascetic, active faith. And she, more than anyone else, saw the abyss into which her sister and all of Russia was hurtling. In the autumn of 1916, shortly before the murder, Elizabeth Feodorovna made a last, desperate attempt to reach her sister. She came to Tsarskoye Selo. This was no mere family visit. It was a clash of two worldviews, two truths. On one side was Elizabeth, remaining faithful to the ideals of duty, honor, and service to the fatherland. She spoke to her sister about the discontent among the people, the hatred of the nobility, the disintegration of the army, and how Rasputin's figure was discrediting the throne and leading the dynasty to ruin. She implored her to come to her senses, to remove the elder before it was too late. On the other side was Alexandra, who had embraced a new, pragmatic reality. For her, protecting Rasputin became synonymous with protecting her son's life, and consequently, the future of the monarchy. Any criticism directed at him was, to her, not a point of reason, but blasphemy, an assault on something sacred. She looked at her sister with cold, estranged eyes, and saw in her not a loving relative, but another enemy, another schemer who understood nothing of her great mission and her great pain. The conversation ended in a complete rupture. "You must choose, me or him," Elizabeth essentially said, and Alexandra silently but firmly chose him. The two sisters, two empresses, parted ways forever, finding themselves on opposing sides of the barricades in the impending civil war. And the most powerful symbolic act marking this turning point was the removal of Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich from the post of Supreme Commander and his replacement by the Emperor himself. Nicholas Nikolaevich was a figure of colossal authority in the army and among the people. He was a symbol of the old guard, professionalism, and dynastic power. and he was a fierce opponent of Rasputin. His resignation, insisted upon by Rasputin and the Empress, was not merely a personnel change, it was a public manifesto. It was a signal to all of Russia. From now on, professionalism, experience and authority meant nothing. Only loyalty to our friend mattered. This act completely unfettered Rasputin. He became the de facto chief of appointments for the empire. That very ministerial merry-go-round began, utterly crippling government administration. Competent ministers were ousted, and utter nobodies took their place, their sole merit being their loyalty to the elder. This was no longer mere influence. This was the direct destruction of the state from within. Thus, the final mutation occurred. The idea of divine intercession, which had once justified Rasputin's presence, was betrayed and forgotten. In its place grew the grotesque idea of personal, unchecked power, based on the superstition and fear of one woman. The rupture with her sister became a symbol of the monarchy's break with reality, and the Grand Duke's resignation, a symbol of its break with its own army and elite. The second point of no return had been crossed. Now, the fall was no longer merely probable. It had become inevitable. Rasputin's murder and the thunderous roar of the February Revolution that followed 2 months later became not merely a political crisis. It was a geological displacement, a tectonic shift that forever altered Russia's social landscape. The first and most obvious losers in this new world were those who, just yesterday, considered themselves its masters. The aristocracy, the high bureaucracy, court circles, this entire brilliant, refined world crumbled like a sugar castle. People whose names had been synonymous with power for centuries, overnight transformed into the formerly powerful, persecuted, despised, stripped of everything. Their palaces were plundered, their estates burned, and they themselves, if they managed, fled abroad, becoming Parisian taxi drivers and waitresses. The social elevator that had slowly lifted their ancestors for centuries now became a guillotine for them. So, who truly emerged victorious? At first glance, it seemed to be the liberal politicians from the State Duma who had formed the provisional government. Their triumph, however, was a phantom, vanishing quickly. The true victors, those who clawed their way out of oblivion, were the ones who had previously languished at rock bottom or deep in the shadows of the underground. The power that slipped from the monarchy's weakening grasp wasn't seized by any single entity. Instead, it shattered into 1,000 fragments. The new elites, the new power centers, weren't ministers in elegant frock coats, but rather individuals in leather jackets and soldiers' greatcoats, commissars of revolutionary committees, chairmen of self-proclaimed Soviets, and agitators previously unknown to anyone, yet possessing the uncanny ability to speak to the masses in their own tongue. A new, raw hierarchy emerged, founded not on lineage or education, but on the possession of a singular resource, a rifle and the ruthless willingness to use it. The economy wasn't reformed. It plunged into a catastrophic nosedive. The entire complex supply system of a vast, warring nation, which had already been sputtering, was utterly paralyzed. Trade routes were severed not by an external enemy, but by internal chaos. Railroads ground to a halt because every soldiers' committee at every station declared itself the supreme authority. Factories ceased operation because the workers, having expelled engineers and directors, had no idea how to manage production. The empire's immense resources weren't channeled into building a new world. They were either plundered, destroyed, or simply rotted away in unreachable warehouses. The new centers of power on the map weren't industrial cities, but rather locations with grain reserves. The primary economic transaction became not a stock exchange deal, but armed food requisition. The world after Rasputin and the Tsar was a realm of absolute distrust. The economy, stripped bare to its bones, devolved into one of pure barter and overt violence. Money transformed into worthless scraps of paper. The only true hard currency became bread, salt, matches, and ammunition. The power of money yielded to the power of the Mauser. It was a regression to an archaic, pre-state existence where rights were determined by might, and the planning horizon narrowed to a single day. Survive today, and tomorrow would reveal itself. This economic collapse was a direct consequence of the political one, a collapse symbolized for so long by Rasputin. A system where personal whim superseded law ultimately spawned a world utterly devoid of legal framework. The psychology of the survivors was a volatile concoction of euphoria and terror. On one hand, there was the intoxicating sensation of freedom. All chains had shattered: class barriers, censorship, the police, and even Father Tsar himself, that bedrock upon which the worldview of millions had rested. The slave of yesterday now felt like a maker of history. But on the other hand, this freedom morphed into a nightmare. The disappearance of the familiar world, of order and predictability, engendered a monstrous collective trauma, a profound sense of disorientation and abandonment. People found themselves in a lawless world where a neighbor might kill a neighbor for a sack of potatoes, and yesterday's hero could be executed as an enemy of the people today. This seismic upheaval fundamentally altered people's worldviews. The centuries-old fatalism and long-suffering patience fostered by orthodoxy and autocracy were supplanted by a fervent belief that the world could and must be remade immediately and by force. The value of human life plummeted to zero. Language coarsened, becoming saturated with military jargon, words like execute, liquidate, requisition. A society that had witnessed the collapse of its old gods was ready to embrace new ones with fanatical devotion, no matter how bloody they might prove to be. The psychological groundwork for the horrors of the Civil War was perfectly laid. A world that had for so long clung to an irrational faith in a single individual, once he fell, was primed to believe in any idea, no matter how radical or inhumane. Beneath the murky foam of scandals, intrigues, and assassinations lay not merely a struggle for power. This was a battle of ideas, a clash between two incompatible philosophical concepts that would determine Russia's destiny. And the central idea that governed all this chaos, the very notion that made the phenomenon of Rasputin possible, was the age-old Russian schism between law and truth. Law represented the cold, rational, formal order imported from the West by Peter the Great. It embodied bureaucracy, statutes, courts, and regulations, the state as a machine. Truth, however, was something entirely different. It was a higher, divine justice that transcended any human law. It was irrational. It resided in the heart of the common people, and its bearer could be not an official, but a holy fool, not a judge, but a man of God. The phenomenon of Rasputin is the story of how the monarchy, weary of the soulless law, made a desperate gamble on mystical truth embodied in a single man. The intellectual engine that created the ideological groundwork for this was not a specific philosopher, but an entire current of Russian thought, Slavophilism and its offshoots. Rasputin, of course, never read Komyakov or Aksakov, but it was they and their followers, decades before his appearance, who forged the cultural code that legitimized him. It was they who articulated the idea of Russia's unique, non-European path. It was they who counterposed the corrupt, rational West with the spiritual might of the God-bearing people. They created the cult of homespun truth, hidden in the soul of the simple peasant, uncorrupted by education and civilization. These were the intellectual architects who designed the pedestal for a popular prophet, never suspecting what grotesque and terrifying figure history would elevate upon it. The ideas of the Slavophiles, initially confined to drawing-room debates, had, by the early 20th century, deeply permeated the consciousness of the ruling elite, including the imperial family itself. The quest for true Russianness, weariness of Petersburg bureaucracy, mystical searches, all of this was fashionable. High society desperately sought confirmation of its connection to the people, seeking a living source of faith unadulterated by the officialdom of the Holy Synod. And Rasputin perfectly fit this demand. He wasn't merely a person. He was a walking argument, living proof of the correctness of all these theories. He arrived and told the elite what they wanted to hear. Salvation lay not in reforms, not in constitutions, not in laws, but in a return to mystical roots, to that very truth he declared himself to embody. Opposing this doctrine was another, no less powerful philosophical tradition, Westernism. Its proponents believed that Russia's salvation lay in modernization, in building an effective law-based state modeled on Europe. They were adherents of law. Their ideal was order, rationality, and institutions. The political embodiment of this idea was Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin. His agrarian reform, his attempts to create a strong class of landowners, his fight against revolutionary terror, his famous declaration, "You want great upheavals, we want a great Russia," all were a hymn to state order, a hymn to law. Stolypin sought to construct a robust framework of functioning institutions in Russia that would make the country strong and predictable. And that is precisely why the conflict between Stolypin and Rasputin was absolutely inevitable and irreconcilable. This was more than mere personal antipathy. It was a war between two civilizational projects. Stolypin saw in Rasputin the living embodiment of the Asian, archaic, irrational chaos he sought to eradicate from Russian life. Rasputin, by his very existence, proved that Stolypin's entire machine of law was powerless if one had direct, informal access to the source of supreme authority. Every healed heir, every minister appointed through his patronage was a blow to the idea of a law-governed state. This was a dispute over the very soul of Russia. Should it become a modern, rational empire or remain a mystical, patriarchal domain governed not by law, but by the personal will of the monarch, guided by a man of God? Who truly emerged victorious? At first glance, it seemed to be the liberal politicians from the State Duma who had formed the provisional government. Their triumph, however, was a phantom, vanishing quickly. The true victors, those who clawed their way out of oblivion, were the ones who had previously languished at rock bottom or deep in the shadows of the underground. The power that slipped from the monarchy's weakening grasp wasn't seized by any single entity. Instead, it shattered into 1,000 fragments. The new elites, the new power centers, weren't ministers in elegant frock coats, but rather individuals in leather jackets and soldiers' greatcoats. Commissars of revolutionary committees, chairmen of self-proclaimed Soviets, and agitators previously unknown to anyone, yet possessing the uncanny ability to speak to the masses in their own tongue. A new, raw hierarchy emerged, founded not on lineage or education, but on the possession of a singular resource, a rifle, and the ruthless willingness to use it. The economy wasn't reformed. It plunged into a catastrophic nosedive. The entire complex supply system of a vast, warring nation, which had already been sputtering, was utterly paralyzed. Trade routes were severed not by an external enemy, but by internal chaos. Railroads ground to a halt because every soldier's committee at every station declared itself the supreme authority. Factories ceased operation because the workers, having expelled engineers and directors, had no idea how to manage production. The empire's immense resources weren't channeled into building a new world. They were either plundered, destroyed, or simply rotted away in unreachable warehouses. The new centers of power on the map weren't industrial cities, but rather locations with grain reserves. The primary economic transaction became not a stock exchange deal, but armed food requisition. The world after Rasputin and the Tsar was a realm of absolute distrust. The economy, stripped bare to its bones, devolved into one of pure barter and overt violence. Money transformed into worthless scraps of paper. The only true hard currency became bread, salt, matches, and ammunition. The power of money yielded to the power of the Mauser. It was a regression to an archaic, pre-state existence where rights were determined by might, and the planning horizon narrowed to a single day. Survive today, and tomorrow would reveal itself. This economic collapse was a direct consequence of the political one, a collapse symbolized for so long by Rasputin. A system where personal whim superseded law ultimately spawned a world utterly devoid of legal framework. The psychology of the survivors was a volatile concoction of euphoria and terror. On one hand, there was the intoxicating sensation of freedom. All chains had shattered. Class barriers, censorship, the police, and even Father Tsar himself, that bedrock upon which the worldview of millions had rested. The slave of yesterday now felt like a maker of history. But on the other hand, this freedom morphed into a nightmare. The disappearance of the familiar world, of order and predictability, engendered a monstrous collective trauma, a profound sense of disorientation and abandonment. People found themselves in a lawless world, where a neighbor might kill a neighbor for a sack of potatoes, and yesterday's hero could be executed as an enemy of the people today. This seismic upheaval fundamentally altered people's worldviews. The centuries-old fatalism and long-suffering patience fostered by orthodoxy and autocracy were supplanted by a fervent belief that the world could and must be remade immediately and by force. The value of human life plummeted to zero. Language coarsened, becoming saturated with military jargon, words like execute, liquidate, requisition. A society that had witnessed the collapse of its old gods was ready to embrace new ones with fanatical devotion, no matter how bloody they might prove to be. The psychological groundwork for the horrors of the Civil War was perfectly laid. A world that had for so long clung to an irrational faith in a single individual once he fell, was primed to believe in any idea, no matter how radical or inhumane. Beneath the murky foam of scandals, intrigues, and assassinations lay not merely a struggle for power. This was a battle of ideas, a clash between two incompatible philosophical concepts that would determine Russia's destiny. And the central idea that governed all this chaos, the very notion that made the phenomenon of Rasputin possible, was the age-old Russian schism between law and truth. Law represented the cold, rational, formal order imported from the West by Peter the Great. It embodied bureaucracy, statutes, courts and regulations, the state as a machine. Truth, however, was something entirely different. It was a higher, divine justice that transcended any human law. It was irrational. It resided in the heart of the common people, and its bearer could be not an official, but a holy fool, not a judge, but a man of God. The phenomenon of Rasputin is the story of how the monarchy, weary of the soulless law, made a desperate gamble on mystical truth embodied in a single man. The intellectual engine that created the ideological groundwork for this was not a specific philosopher, but an entire current of Russian thought, Slavophilism and its offshoots. Rasputin, of course, never read Komyakov or Aksakov, but it was they and their followers, decades before his appearance, who forged the cultural code that legitimized him. It was they who articulated the idea of Russia's unique, non-European path. It was they who counterposed the corrupt, rational West with the spiritual might of the God-bearing people. They created the cult of homespun truth, hidden in the soul of the simple peasant, uncorrupted by education and civilization. These were the intellectual architects who designed the pedestal for a popular prophet, never suspecting what grotesque and terrifying figure history would elevate upon it. The ideas of the Slavophiles, initially confined to drawing-room debates, had, by the early 20th century, deeply permeated the consciousness of the ruling elite, including the imperial family itself. The quest for true Russianness, weariness of Petersburg bureaucracy, mystical searches, all of this was fashionable. High society desperately sought confirmation of its connection to the people, seeking a living source of faith unadulterated by the officialdom of the Holy Synod. And Rasputin perfectly fit this demand. He wasn't merely a person. He was a walking argument, living proof of the correctness of all these theories. He arrived and told the elite what they wanted to hear. Salvation lay not in reforms, not in constitutions, not in laws, but in a return to mystical roots, to that very truth he declared himself to embody. Opposing this doctrine was another, no less powerful philosophical tradition, Westernism. Its proponents believed that Russia's salvation lay in modernization, in building an effective law-based state modeled on Europe. They were adherents of law. Their ideal was order, rationality, and institutions. The political embodiment of this idea was Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin. His agrarian reform, his attempts to create a strong class of landowners, his fight against revolutionary terror, his famous declaration, "You want great upheavals, we want a great Russia," all were a hymn to state order, a hymn to law. Stolypin sought to construct a robust framework of functioning institutions in Russia that would make the country strong and predictable. And that is precisely why the conflict between Stolypin and Rasputin was absolutely inevitable and irreconcilable. This was more than mere personal antipathy. It was a war between two civilizational projects. Stolypin saw in Rasputin the living embodiment of the Asian, archaic, irrational chaos he sought to eradicate from Russian life. Rasputin, by his very existence, proved that Stolypin's entire machine of law was powerless if one had direct, informal access to the source of supreme authority. Every healed heir, every minister appointed through his patronage, was a blow to the idea of a law-governed state. This was a dispute over the very soul of Russia. Should it become a modern, rational empire or remain a mystical, patriarchal domain governed not by law but by the personal will of the monarch, guided by a man of God? The tragedy for Russia was that, in this battle of ideas, the monarchy ultimately chose Rasputin over Stolypin. After the Prime Minister's assassination, the path for truth to definitively triumph over law lay wide open. Nicholas II, and particularly Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, made a fatal philosophical choice. They rejected the path of modernization, reforms, and institutions, instead betting on a personal miracle, on an archaic belief that a single holy man could save the empire. This decision was not merely a political misstep. It was a betrayal of the very concept of a modern state. And a state founded on mysticism rather than law, embroiled in the brutal warfare of the 20th century, was doomed to unravel. It collapsed, leaving behind only wreckage, upon which the ultimately victorious law was inscribed not with ink, but with blood. Rasputin's assassins expected applause. They were convinced that by excising this festering wound, they would hear a collective sigh of relief from all of Russia. Instead, an echoing, deathly silence descended. The grand system of informal power, meticulously constructed by the elder, did not collapse with a resounding crash. It began to disintegrate differently, quietly, from within, like a corpse that still retains its outward form, but is already undergoing an inexorable process of putrefaction within. Immediately after its architect's death, the system began to devour itself. There was no external enemy to strike a blow. The blow had already been struck from within, and now the process of entropy began. Deprived of its central processor, its sole source of will, the system fell into a stupor, and then into agony. The battle for Rasputin's legacy was both grotesque and tragic. But the legacy was not money or titles. The inheritance was direct access to the Empress's will, that red phone connecting to the pinnacle of power. And a fierce struggle immediately erupted for this phantom lever. The first claimant to the role of heir was Minister of Internal Affairs Alexander Protopopov, a man whose entire career was owed to Rasputin. Stripped of his patron, he lost all footing. In a desperate bid to cling to influence, he began holding séances, assuring the Empress that he was communicating with the spirit of the murdered elder and receiving directives from him. This was no longer politics. It was a theater of the absurd, pure surrealism. The grand idea of divine guidance was torn to shreds and devolved into a pathetic attempt to retain power through parlor magic. The other heirs, the assassins themselves, also sought to claim their share. They expected that a grateful emperor would draw them close, heed their counsel, and begin to save the country. But they were gravely mistaken. They carved up the grand idea of saving the monarchy, each interpreting it to their own advantage. Yusupov envisioned himself a lone hero, Purishkevich a political leader of a new patriotic movement. But to the Tsar and Tsarina, they were not saviors, but vile murderers, traitors who had violated all divine and human laws. Instead of gratitude, they received disfavor and exile. Their attempt to inherit a healthy monarchy failed because they missed the crucial point. By killing Rasputin, they had not slain a disease, but rather the last painkiller, without which the system could no longer endure. But the most loyal and most tragic bearer of Rasputin's legacy became Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna herself. She was that final shard, the last guardian of the true idea. In her mind, the assassination transformed the elder from a friend into a holy martyr. She clung with doubled fanatical fervor to his memory, his advice, his prophecies. She became his high priestess, rejecting any attempts to reach through to her. Her sister, Princess Victoria of Battenberg, wrote her desperate letters from England, pleading with her to heed the voice of reason, to make concessions to society. Alexandra's reply was cold and unyielding. She believed in the wisdom of her people, who would not betray God's anointed, and all else was but the intrigues of a handful of aristocrats. She became the final bastion of resistance against common sense. To the very end, she clung to the worldview Rasputin had painted for her, a world containing a holy imperial family, dark forces that envied them, and a simple people who loved them. She became the last bearer of this faith, and this faith blinded and deafened her. She failed to see the revolution gathering beyond the palace windows, failed to hear the roar of the approaching crowd. She lived in a world where the spirit of the martyr Grigori protected her, and this unwavering fidelity to the idea until the very end became her undoing. The symbol of the era's demise was Rasputin's clandestine, almost furtive funeral. His body, recovered from an ice hole, was, by the Empress's personal command, interred in a secluded corner of Tsarskoye Selo Park. Only the imperial family and a handful of their most intimate confidants attended the service. This was no burial for a statesman. It was a ritualistic concealment of a profound secret, a desperate attempt to bury what had already detonated the empire from within. The Empress placed an icon upon the slain man's chest, bearing the signatures of herself, her daughters, and Anna Virubova. But history refused to allow this secret to remain entombed. Following the February Revolution, upon the provisional government's orders, soldiers exhumed Rasputin's coffin. It was transported to the outskirts of Petrograd, where, deep within a forest, his remains were publicly immolated on an enormous pyre. This act of desecration was the ultimate punctuation mark. The age of Rasputin, which began with whispered mystical rumors, concluded with a pagan ritual of burning, signaling the irreversible collapse of the old world. Meanwhile, the last torchbearer of his vision, Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, was already treading her own Via Dolorosa, a path that would tragically culminate just a few months later in the basement of Ipatiev House. With her death, the final shard of a grand and terrifying illusion finally perished. Once the bonfire in the Petrograd woods had consumed the last vestiges of Rasputin's remains, he plunged into a second, far more enduring oblivion. But this was no simple fading from memory. It was a peculiar Soviet brand of historical erasure. Upon seizing power, the Bolsheviks didn't merely forget Rasputin. They sterilized, mummified, and enshrined him in their pantheon of arch-villains. For 70 long years, his very image was embalmed in the formaldehyde of official propaganda. He became a flat, cardboard cutout, a mere illustration for the thesis of the rotten Tsarist regime. From a complex, tragic historical figure, he devolved into a convenient bogeyman, a lecherous, drunken peasant, a symbol of senility and decay. Any attempts to delve deeper, to see anything beyond the caricature, were swiftly suppressed. He was relegated to the role of a mere extra in the grand drama of the revolution, frozen in that part for decades. The moment of his rediscovery arrived in the late 1980s, during the era of glasnost, like a dam breaking loose. When ideological prohibitions crumbled and archives opened, an informational deluge washed over the nation. Suddenly, bookstore shelves brimmed with the memoirs of Felix Yusupov, the diaries of Anna Virubova, interrogation transcripts, police reports, all that had been classified as secret for decades. And society, ravenous for its true, unvarnished history, devoured it voraciously. The effect was astonishing. From beneath the thick layers of Soviet propaganda, a completely different person suddenly began to emerge. More complex, more terrifying, and far more intriguing than the simplistic villain from school textbooks. It was a true renaissance. Newspapers and magazines vied with each other to publish sensational material. Historians and writers, such as Edvard Radzinsky, crafted their own reconstructions of events, transforming the Rasputin saga into a genuine national bestseller. People saw for the first time not merely a dissolute rake, but a figure of hypnotic power, not just a charlatan, but a healer whose abilities, however inexplicable, were accepted as fact by the nation's most powerful family. They grasped the full complexity of court intrigues and the profound tragedy of the Empress's predicament. This rediscovery was more than an act of historical justice. It was a session of national psychoanalysis, an attempt to re-examine and process the trauma that had initiated the entire Soviet era. But it was here, amidst this chaotic rediscovery, that the most fascinating development occurred, a new, utterly misguided interpretation of his figure. The new post-Soviet era, in search of fresh heroes and new meanings, began projecting onto Rasputin's image qualities that were never truly present. An astonishing pendulum swing occurred. From an absolute villain, he suddenly began to transform into his complete antithesis, a holy martyr. Among certain monarchist and orthodox nationalist circles, a new myth emerged. Rasputin as a true man of the people, a homespun prophet slandered by liberal pro-Western aristocracy and Freemasons. His assassination came to be interpreted as a ritualistic act, a strike at the very heart of Holy Rus. In parallel, another equally fantastic image emerged, Rasputin as a Russian Nostradamus, a clairvoyant endowed with supernatural powers. In an era captivated by mysticism and esotericism, he became a pop culture icon, a superhuman whose prophecies about the dynasty's demise and Russia's future were quoted alongside the predictions of Baba Vanga. His historical figure was utterly divorced from reality, transforming into a brand, a convenient symbol for everything mysterious and irrational. Thus, the long echo of his life proved paradoxical. 70 years of oblivion as a demon gave way to 30 years of chaotic resurrection, first as a saint, then as a sorcerer. And therein lies the central irony of his posthumous fate. Both Soviet propaganda and modern mythmakers, seemingly from opposing viewpoints, do the same thing. They deny him the right to be merely human. They continue to see him as either absolute evil, absolute good, or a supernatural force. And the real Grigory Rasputin, a complex, contradictory, sinful, and perhaps intuitively brilliant Siberian peasant, remains buried. But now, not in the frozen earth of Tsarskoye Selo, but beneath thick layers of new contemporary myths that we create to explain not so much him, but ourselves. And so, having journeyed this far, we return to where we began, the paradox of power. Our story started with a society in which formal state institutions were so paralyzed and inefficient that an enormous demand arose for informal, hands-on governance, for someone who could resolve any issue outside the law and regulations. This demand birthed Rasputin. But behold the astonishing turn history takes. After the revolution swept away both Rasputin and the old system, a new, even more rigid and formalized one was built upon its ruins. Yet, did the underlying problem vanish? No, it merely mutated. In Rasputin's place came a system of blat, informal connections and telephone law, where personal ties and access to the leader's inner circle again proved more crucial than any written statute. The great cycle closed. Russia, in its attempt to cure itself of the malady of informal power, ultimately only reproduced it in new, even uglier forms. And here before us stands the main, irresolvable paradox of this entire saga. The Russian monarchy, the last bastion of sacred divine power in Europe at the most critical juncture of its history, gambled on even greater sacrality, on a miracle, on direct divine intervention through its chosen one. It attempted to save itself from the encroaching chaos of the 20th century by sheltering behind a mystical prophet. And it was precisely this desperate attempt to reinforce its divine legitimacy that led to its complete and final desanctification. In its search for a saint, it earned the reputation of a madhouse, opening the door to the most godless and materialistic forces history has ever known. The pursuit of an absolute miracle inevitably begot an absolute catastrophe. Rasputin's figure proved to be a perfect mirror, but it was not a funhouse mirror, distorting reality. On the contrary, it was horrifyingly precise. Everyone saw in him a reflection of their own fears and hopes. The Empress saw him as a savior and a saint because she desperately craved salvation and sanctity. The aristocracy saw him as a demon and a debauchee because it allowed them to explain their own impotence and the impending collapse of their world. Liberals saw him as a symbol of a decaying autocracy because it justified their struggle for power. And the common people saw him as one of their own, a peasant who climbed to the very top and exacted revenge on the haughty gentry. Rasputin deceived no one. He simply was what people wanted him to be. He was an empty vessel that everyone filled with their own content. And this is his main historical function. He was neither cause nor effect. He was a diagnosis. He was a dark X-ray, which showed with merciless clarity all the metastases that afflicted the organism of the Russian Empire. Paralysis of will, atrophy of institutions, a chasm between power and the elite, between the elite and the people. And looking at that X-ray, it becomes clear that the patient was already incurable. This story offers no easy answers. It does not divide heroes into black and white. It demonstrates how good intentions, amplified by fear, lead to hell. How faith, detached from reality, becomes a destructive force. How a system that has lost trust is willing to throw itself into the arms of anyone who promises a simple solution. And this lesson has no expiration date. It is eternal, like the very nature of power itself. And gazing upon all this great and terrible cycle, the central, irresolvable question arises. What is more dangerous for society? The cold imperfection of functioning, yet soulless institutions, or the fervent belief in one person who promises a miracle but leads to the abyss? Is a figure like Rasputin an inevitable product of any systemic crisis, an eternal companion of a weary society, or do we still have a chance to learn how to repair our complex mechanisms without resorting to magic and without staring into the eyes of yet another prophet in search of a simple answer?